Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning to the audience and panel. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Nursyafika, moderator for our panel discussion today. So, today about our panel discussion, the topic that to discuss is an international non-tariff trade barriers affect developing countries. We discuss this topic because it is very popular issue. Non-tariff trade barriers are that restrict import or export of goods or service through mechanism other than the simple imposition of tariff. The Southern Africa Development Community define a non-tariff barrier as any obstacle to international trade that is not on import or export duty. Based on our topic, we have invited some panelists to tell us more on our pleasure. Let me introduce and thank you to all the panelists coming for today. So, the first panelist we will invite is Mr. Adeeb FIkri, the Senior Minister of MITI. The second panelist is Ms. Nuramira, the Director Global Relations Secretary of OECD. And the last panelist is Ms. Siti Hudzaifah, the General Counsel of WTO. Alright, let's talk about our topic. I want to ask your opinion, Ms. Siti Hudzaifah, about international non-tariff trade barriers affect developing countries. For you, what is the objective of non-tariff trade barriers to our country?
The main objective of this non-tariff trade barrier is to obtain the source of national revenue through import duty or excise duty imposed on imported goods. The second is to protect young and local industries. The third is anti-dumping, which is to prevent the dumping of imported goods in the market. The fourth is to enable young and local industries to compete in the domestic market. Last but not least is the safety factor to prevent the entry of dangerous goods.
So, you think your opinion can make our country be a more successful? Okay, thank you for the answer, Ms. Hudzaifah. So, the second question I want to ask to Mr. Adeeb FIkri. What are types of non-tariff trade barriers, and can you explain the type of non-tariff trade barriers?
Thank you to Ms. Moderator. First of all, we have protectionist barriers. Protectionist barriers are designed and created to protect domestic industries at the expense of other countries. The restrictions, or we call it as barriers, make it difficult for other countries to compete with locally produced goods and services. The barriers may take form of licensing requirements, allocation of quotas, anti-dumping duties, and import deposits. Moreover, assistive policies is one of types of non-tariff barriers. Although assistive policies are designed to protect domestic companies and enterprises, they do not directly restrict trade with other countries, but they implement action that can impede free trade with other countries. Examples of assistive barriers include custom procedures, packaging and labeling requirements, technical standards, and sanitary standards. Last but not least are non-protectionist policies. They are not designed to directly restrict the import or export of goods and services, but the overall outcomes may lead to free trade restrictions. The policies are primarily designed to protect the health and safety of people and animals while maintaining the integrity of environment. Examples of non-protectionist policies include licensing, packaging and labeling requirements, plant and animals inspections, import bans for specific fishing or harvesting methods, and sanitary rules.
Okay, thank you for the explanation. I think the audience already know now all kinds and understand about the non-tariff trade barriers. So, Ms. Nuramira, what is the reason a country does non-tariff trade barriers?
Thank you, Moderator, for the question. So, the reason a country does non-tariff barrier is, first, the government want to protect domestic employment. High import are intensifying competition and threatening domestic industry. When it cannot compete, the industry die and leave more unemployed in the country. Second, the government is trying to protect the new industry. By limiting import, the government reduce competitive pressure on the infant industry. That way, the industry can grow, reach a mature stage and be more competitive in the international market. Last, trade barrier as a retaliatory reaction. The government protect it from unfair competition by partner countries. When partner countries impose barrier, it is in government interest to take similar steps.
Thank you, Ms. Mimi Nuramira. Back to Ms. Hudzaifah. I want to ask you the advantage of non-tariff trade barriers.
The advantage of non-tariff trade barriers are to protect home industries from foreign competition. Trade barriers are enforced in order to give protection to home industries by avoiding competition from other countries. Such competition is harmful and may bring home industries in difficulties. Government has to give support and protection to home industries, and for such protection, import must be discouraged or stopped. This is possible through the creation of different trade barriers and restricting imports. Second, to conserve foreign exchange reserve, a country has to pay for imports through its foreign exchange reserve. Large-scale imports mean heavy pressure on available reserve of foreign currencies. Such policy will ultimately lead to a foreign exchange crisis. On the other hand, foreign exchange will be saved through import substitution and import restriction. Third, to maintain favorable balance of trade and payment position, large-scale imports lead to deficit in the balance of trade and balance of payment. Such deficit is undesirable and puts heavy strain on the available foreign exchange. For removing such deficit, imports should be restricted and export should be promoted. Trade barriers are useful for reducing imports. They are advocates for reducing deficit in the balance of trade and payment position. The term of balance of trade suggests the difference between export and import, which may be positive or negative. It is positive when export are more than the import. It is negative when export are less as compared to import within a specific period, normally 1 year. Poor and developing countries normally have to face the problem of negative balance of trade. Next, to protect national economy from dumping, foreign countries may try to capture domestic market by offering their goods at a very low price. The purpose is to sell surplus production. Such technique of dumping is profitable to rich countries but harm poor countries. To avoid situation are imposed. As a result, foreign goods become costly and the adverse effect on home market is avoided. Next, to make the country strong and self-sufficient. Trade barriers are useful for making the country strong and self-sufficient. Import restriction lead to production of new commodities within the country through import substitution. Dependence on other countries is reduced considerably. A domestic industry is made competitive in the long run.
Well, Ms. Siti Hudzaifah told us the advantage about non-tariff trade barriers. If there is good, there must be bad as well. I mean, the disadvantage about non-tariff trade barriers for our country. So, Mr. Adeeb FIkri, can you tell us about the disadvantage?
So, now I will share about disadvantages of non-tariff trade barriers. There are a few disadvantages of non-tariff trade barriers. First and foremost, the government cannot generate extra income. Under the tariff, the government imposes a tax on imported goods. On the other hand, it does not apply to non-tariff barriers. Secondly, non-tariff barriers limit the functioning of free market. Free market advocates view this as causing the inefficient allocation of resources in global markets. Countries should specialize and trade products that have a comparative advantage. That way, free trade results in maximum benefits. However, the benefits diminished because the government intervened through the non-tariff barriers. Next, the cost of running a business increases. The company has to fulfill several administrative requirements such as product standardization and complicated custom procedures. Lastly, exporters must face unfair competition in partner countries. Non-tariff barriers are beneficial for domestic companies but put foreign companies at disadvantage. Exporters must sell fewer goods under quota policy. When exposed to quota restrictions, they have to find other markets to sell their products. If not, they have to cut productions and lowering income and profits. Also, devaluation policies make exporters' goods more expensive, so they are less competitive in local market.
Thank you to Mr. Adeeb FIkri, because we already know about that. Besides Malaysia, we know many other countries involved of non-tariff trade barriers. So, which country are involved in non-tariff trade barriers? Can you ask this question, Miss Mimi Nuramira?
There are many countries that involves in non-tariff trade barrier. For most economies in the world, their leading export and import trading partner in the term of value is either the European Union or China, and to a certain degree the United States and Japan. Other countries like Russia, Brazil, India and South Africa are emerging significant market or source country in different parts of the world. Individually, for each European member state with all others European Union's member collectively is greater than any other trading partner. Both the European Union and the United States have China as their largest origin of import. China's largest source of import is European Union. In other parts of the world, the European Union or the United States is the largest trading partner. However, other leading trading countries may be the most prominent in certain countries. Brazil, Russia and South Africa are becoming increasingly dominant in their respective regional area.
Next question I want to ask to Ms. Hudzaifah. This question is how non-tariff trade barriers affect the economy.
It affects the economy by produce at a relative lower opportunity cost and trade for what they would otherwise have to produce at a higher opportunity cost. This means nations produce more goods and services for less and exchange those for goods and services from other countries, resulting in the higher levels of consumption than would be possible without trade. Through the process, productivity increase as a resource flow to the economic activity in which a country has a comparative advantage. This leads to employment gains where production is most efficient. True, it can also lead to employment loss in sectors where production is comparatively less efficient. An outcome of which policymakers should remain cognizant on net. 2. Trade result is higher level of productivity, income, and output throughout the economy. And over time, increased trade has made the United States more productivity and has contributed to large increase in American standard of living.
Thank you for your information, Ms. Hudzaifah. Mr. Adeeb FIkri, may I ask you what is the difference between tariff and non-tariff trade barriers?
There are a few differences between tariff and non-tariff barriers. Firstly, tariff barriers implies the taxes or duties imposed by the government on its imports, so as to provide protection to its domestic companies and increase government revenue. But non-tariff barriers cover all the restrictions other than taxes imposed by the government on its imports to protect the domestic companies and discriminate the new entrants. Next, for tariff barriers, World Trade Organization or we called it as WTO, allowed the imposition of tariff barriers to its member nation, but at a reasonable rate. On the other hand, for non-tariff barriers, World Trade Organization abolished the imposition of import quotas and voluntary export restraints. Moreover, tariff barriers make high profits produced by the importers can be controlled, but it is hard and impossible to control completely profits produced by the importers for non-tariff barriers. Last but not least, for tariff barriers, it affects the price of imported goods and services, but for non-tariff barriers, it affects the quantity or price or both of the imported goods.
Okay, thank you Mr. Adeeb Fikri. Back to Ms. Mimi Nuramira. For you, how to overcome trade barriers in international trade?
There are three ways to overcome trade barriers. First, trade and economic sanctions. Choose a different market not affected by economic sanctions. Delay market in entry if it appears sanction may be lifted. Secondly, export and import controls. Select a different market with which to trade and develop alternative good to trade. And lastly, government subsidy apply. Okay, develop value added activity in the target market to increase the attractiveness for foreign purchase, and adapt the product or the service to give it a more appeal and justify the exchange price.
Thank you to Ms. Mimi Nuramira. So, the next question is, what do you think about benefit of reducing barriers to international trade, Ms. Hudzaifah?
The benefit of reducing barriers to international trade is increase the size of the world economy by $160 billion to $385 billion per year. Depending on the precise deal that this amount is not half, it is an increase of 1% or less. The economic gains from expanding international trade are measured in $100 billion, and the gains from the international trade as a whole probably reach well into $1 trillion. The potential for gains from trade may be especially high among the smaller and lower income countries of the world.
I hope the benefit can make our country success. So, Mr. Adeeb Fikri, how does non-tariff barriers affect trade?
Countries commonly use non-tariff barriers in international trade. Decisions about when to impose non-tariff barriers are influenced by the political alliance of a country and the overall availability of goods and services. In general, any barrier to international trade, including tariff and non-tariff barriers, influence the global economy because it limits the functions of the free market. The lost revenue that some companies may experience from these barriers to trade may be considered an economic loss, especially for proponents of laissez-faire capitalism. Advocates of laissez-faire capitalism believe that governments should abstain from interfering in the works of the free market. Countries can use non-tariff barriers in place of conventional tariff barriers, which are taxes that an exporting country pays to an importing country for goods or services. Tariffs are the most common type of trade barrier, and they increase the cost of products and services in importing country.
In non-tariff, trade barriers has many types and other that we already know. But what are examples of non-tariff trade barriers? I think I want to ask this question to Ms. Hudzaifah.
There are a few examples of non-tariff trade barrier. First, license. Licenses are one of the most common instruments that countries use to regulate the import of goods. License system allows authorized companies to import specific commodities that are included in the list of licensed goods. Product license can either be a general license or a one-time license. The general license allows importation and exportation of permits goods for a specific period. The one-time license allows a specific product importer to import a specific quantity of the product, and it specifies the cost, country of origin, and the custom point through which the importation will be carried out. Second, quotas. Quotas are quantitative restrictions that impose on import and export of a specific product for a specific period. Countries use quotas as direct form of the administrative regulation of a foreign trade, and it narrows down the range of countries where firms can trade certain commodities. It caps the number of goods that can be imported or exported at any given time. The next example is embargoes. Embargoes are total bans of trade on specific commodities and may be imposed on import or export of specific goods that are supplied to or from specific countries. They are considered legal barriers to trade, and government may implement such measures to achieve specific economic and political goals. The last example is import deposit. Import deposit is a form of foreign trade regulation that requires importers to pay the central bank of the country a specified sum of money for a definite period. The amount paid should be equal to the cost of import goods.
Thank you to Ms. Hudzaifah. So, we have reached the last question. I hope Ms. Mimi Nuramira can answer this question. In your opinion, what is non-tariff trade barriers and argument for protection?
A more specific context for trade and conflict be the way in which trade is complicated during wartime. In the trade during wartime can be a substantial threat to the nation depending on the scale and scope of the conflict. For example, consider World War II. In this scenario, Germany was largely isolated in the conflict and therefore had extremely limited trade partner. Direct conflict will almost always result in a complete crisis in trading, not only between the country in which the war is occurring, but also any of that country's allies. However, some argue self-sufficiency in war is not necessary, as friendly nations will still provide trade and economic support. Sanctions also play a dramatic role as an offensive militaristic maneuver. Iran and North Korea are strong modern examples, as well as the recent history of the US-Iraq War. In all of these circumstances, either the US alone or along with a number of allies actively limited the ability for this country to trade and generate economic value for their nations.
Thank you to the Miss Mimi Amira. So, we have reached the end. Let me conclude a little bit about international non-tariff trade barriers affect developing countries. Non-tariff trade barriers can protect local industry from foreign competitors. In addition, non-tariff trade barriers also may offer protection to certain economies against those interested in trading with them only, and increase employment opportunities in the country. So, that's all our panel discussion today. I hope the audience gets the information that has been presented by the panel. Thank you a lot for lending your ears and spending your time for our panel discussion.